Good morning, everyone. I'm Melanie Cohen. Welcome to the July session of the HUD OCIO Learning Session. Particular welcome to those people here in the room and, of course, those people who are watching on the internet. So thank you very much for participating. We're trying something different this month. What we're trying to do is implement some of the most recent technology. So what we have is a Skype session that's going to be going on. And we have Dr. Gail Fairhurst from the University of Cincinnati, who is actually in her office at the University of Cincinnati, who's going to be joining us. And she's going to be able to take questions from the audience. It's going to be something a little bit different. We're trying this out, and I anticipate that it's going to go quite well. So let me tell you a little bit something about Gail. For those of you who have not seen her bio, and I think a lot of people probably have, but she's an award-winning professor of organizational communication at the University of Cincinnati. She's an international speaker and management consultant and executive coach for such companies as McDonald's, Boeing, Procter & Gamble, and General Electric. She's written 3 books and 60 articles. And what she'll be talking about today is, the title of her discussion is, If I'm Talking, I Must Be Communicating. And the interesting thing about that is, of course, I think we know when you're talking, you're not always communicating. So what I'd like to do, though, prior to introducing her, is just make 1 or 2 administrative comments. We want to make sure that she can hear your questions. So we have somebody here in the audience with us, Rusty Noble. Rusty, you want to raise your hand? He is going to be handing the microphone out to you. So don't just kind of yell out a question because she won't be able to hear it. Wait for the microphone so she can hear the question. And for HUD employees, either here or in the field watching on the internet, please sign the sign-in sheet so you can get some training credit for this. So with that, let me introduce to you Dr. Gail Fairhurst.
So today, my webinar objectives are to really do 3 things. First is to discover how leaders shape context through framing. Second, to assess your framing style along with its strengths and challenges. And learn 3 powerful techniques to improve your framing. And this will have a tremendous impact, I believe, on your ability to understand communication as not just talking. So I always like to begin, thanks for patience, by the way, with a story that David Foster Wallace, the late American writer, told at the commencement address that he gave at Kenyon College in 2005. He began by telling the story of 2 young fish who were swimming along and passed by an older fish who looked at them and said, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" Well, the 2 young fish swam on for a bit and looked over at the others suddenly and said, "What the hell is water?" Well, for Wallace's young fish, the most profound realities of life, the ones most difficult to see and talk about. One of those realities is the remarkable gift of human communication. And if you substitute communication for water, "What the hell is water?" wonderfully describes many managers and organizations today who take their communications for granted. It's also the basis for the title of my presentation today, If I'm Talking, I Must Be Communicating. People who equate talking with communicating may easily take their communications for granted, just like these fish. When we only associate communication with talking, we're missing out on the power and the potential of communication to establish sound business practices, and perhaps most importantly, a trusting work climate. So my hope today is to begin to turn this around by getting you to focus on a communication skill I believe underlies all others. That is the skill of framing. Yes. So, how do you think of communication? For many of us, our first introduction to communication, and I'll be expecting there'll be a slide in front of you that will say, "How do you think of communication?" As I understand it, that's the slide that we began to have problems with. My point with this slide is simply to suggest that all of us were trained to see communication as an act of transmission, right? It was just something from a sender, a message from a sender to a receiver over a channel. And if you have a top-down version of communication that is, based on authority, that's simply another version of seeing communication quite simplistic. This is not an incorrect view of communication, but in fact, it is a view of communication that's a little too narrow for our purposes, because the way in which we should be seeing communication is in terms about the creation of meaning. And that means that we should be focusing on the skill of framing. Next slide, if you will, Melanie. With the skill of framing, what the best way I think to see it is a meaning-centered view is to look at a quote by Lou Pondy. And that quote is the following: "The dual capacity to make sense of things and to put them into language meaning to large numbers of people gives the person who has it enormous leverage." I'm not seeing the new slide, Melanie. Can we get that up? All right. Essentially, with this quote, there's two features. One is to make sense of things, and secondly, to focus language. So if we look at that view of a meaning-centered communication, logical skill that results from that is the skill of framing. And because that is the ability to shape meaning, to choose one meaning over another when we communicate. And so that's the key skill that we want to keep in mind. By focusing on framing, we can begin to focus on who we're creating when we operate work environment, and how we do so in a way that's very functional at times, and in ways that's not very functional. And if we'll go to the next slide, we'll see a couple of examples of framing. One with Tony Hayward, who is the former CEO of BP Oil back in 2000. Tony around the Gulf of Mexico, because he was quoted as saying, quote, "There's no one who wants this thing over more than I do. I want my life back." And this was seen as very insensitive to the fishermen, who many of whom had livelihoods at stake with the oil spill. So there was a problem with his framing there. A second example is with Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State. She was making her rounds in Africa in 2010, visiting the Congo, and she was asked the question by someone in the audience as to what President Bill Clinton thought of the situation in the Congo, to which Clinton ripped out her earphones and angrily replied, "My husband is not the Secretary of State, I am." Now, interestingly, her staff at first treated it as a mistake, indicating that the secretary was tired, but actually Clinton herself and the State Department let those comments stand on the record. And it was a rare moment of, I think, emotional honesty in diplomatic dealings, especially in light of some of the women's issues that were occurring during the time. If we could go to the next slide, Melanie. So what I wanted to do as we introduce the skill of framing is to give you an idea as to perhaps how sensitive you might be to this skill, and therefore to seeing communication as about the creation of meaning. And so if you had a chance to fill out the framing style inventory, that's what this is about. For those of you who have not had that chance, don't worry. You can either go to my book, The Power of Framing, or you can go to www.leadershipframing.com and you can get a copy of the inventory there. And also, Melanie probably can make a copy available to you as well. In any event, this research that tests that sensitivity to framing is really based on the work of Barbara J. O'Keefe at Northwestern. And she found in her research over now some 30 years, 3 distinct kinds of communication styles. We are going to, as I go through each one of them, each style has both strengths and disadvantages, but one of those styles is particularly sensitive to the framing concept. And so I want to talk about how that relates as we go through. So again, if you have a score for yourself because you've completed the
survey, that's great. If you haven't, you can certainly take it afterwards. Next slide, please. So if we can go to that first slide and you see that very colorful parrot, the first one I'm going to talk about is the expressive. And I wanted to ask you a question. Next slide, Melanie. Do you have friends or coworkers or someone in your family or perhaps yourself who seems to lack an edit function? These folks sometimes say things that are hilarious, outrageous, sometimes embarrassing, sometimes horrifying. They just simply say things that many of us would not say. These individuals, I would argue, are least sensitive to the skill of framing because their primary goal as communicators is simply just to express themselves and to react to others. So for them, language is simply the means to expression, and messages are only edited when there are negative consequences are clearly apparent. Now, some of my students tell me that, in fact, those who are expressives come from families of expressives, that seems to be a norm within their families to be able to speak very bluntly. Nevertheless, these folks say what comes to mind. If you ask them, an expressive, why they said what they said, they simply said, that's what I was thinking. Now, if you think that if there is a possible upside and that it might have something to do with trust, you're absolutely right. Because, right, expressives are not playing games with us, and as a result, they say what they think, and they're pretty honest in their communication. So that, in fact, is a possible upside, even though they tend to be least sensitive to the framing concept. If we could go to the next slide, and you will see 3 examples of expressives. Ted Turner, who is, of course, founder of CNN, his nickname was Mouth from the South, and that was strictly due to the fact that amazing things came out of his mouth at times. Bobby Knight, you see that rather angry-looking depiction of him. Here's a coach who's not known for his restraint, both on or off the basketball court. And the third picture that we have here is Linda Wapner. And Linda Wapner is one of Fortune magazine's America's Toughest Bosses. In fact, one of the first female leaders to make it into that special issue. And the reason is because she was known to scream, swear, and use rather emasculating language. So you can see that we've got 3 folks who are pretty much say what they think and let the chips fall where they may. If we could go to the next slide, Melanie. So, as I mentioned, if you ask an expressive, why did you say what you say, the expressive says, that's what I was thinking. The next category is what's known as a conventional. And if you ask the conventional, why did you say what you said? The conventional says because that's what's appropriate. The conventional sees communication as a cooperative game to be played, and the fact that communication is governed by social rules and customs. So for the expressive, language is simply a means to expression in terms of the social effect one wants to achieve, rather than the thoughts one has. So again, the expressive is very much wanting to play the rules. The expressive is very much wanting to be a part of the situation, and as a result of that, they are very much attending to what's appropriate in that situation. From a framing perspective, the conventional has good sensitivity to the framing concept, and they do have good sensitivity to how meanings get created. The possible downside of a conventional, however, is that they're merely reactive to the context. That is, they see the context somewhat narrowly, and as a result of that, they perhaps don't exploit the opportunities that are available to them. If we could go to the next slide, and you're going to see some examples of conventionals. And with these examples, what I would first say is that most managers fall into this category. I've been doing a lot of this kind of surveying with this kind of instrument for probably 15 years now, and the consultant friends that I have that use this have the same sort of reaction in the folks that they test, and that is most managers are conventional. I would also put Bill Gates in this category from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which is not to say this guy isn't a visionary, but simply that his communication style is more conventional. And George Pataki, former 9/11 New York governor. He's an interesting story, and let me say why. You know, when we think about 9/11 leadership, we have a tendency to think about Rudy Giuliani. And if you go back to those events, I think you can begin to get a pretty clear picture why. For example, the news conferences shortly thereafter, after the incident, you saw Giuliani, who was speaking to the American public in terms of addressing their emotions, right? It was shock, it was fear, it was horror, it was grief, all of those things, and he was addressing those emotions. In addition to that, he was appealing to these higher orders of God and country, and he was trying to make us feel better at that moment because those are the kinds of things I think that would soothe the populace at that time. What Pataki did at those news conferences was really quite interesting. He simply thanked the dignitaries and very little else. So he would go from group to group to group to group, and who had all been pitching in, but he didn't really seize that moment in the way that Giuliani did. And that's why we remember Giuliani for his leadership, not Pataki. And ironically, I'm sure Pataki was working just as hard behind the scenes. So it's a great example of how a conventional, what a conventional's response is. If we could go to the next slide, Melanie, and we're going to see this demonstrated in just an interesting way. What do you see here? And most of you would say, well, right, I see a man who's walking. And in fact, a conventional sees that same thing and sees the context as fixed. But could we go to the full slide now, Melanie? And you will see that, in fact, the strategic sees the context from multiple angles. And thus, the context, they would argue, is open to shaping. Next slide. Okay. Yep, keep going. Very good. You see the shadow there, and you see the difference in terms of how the strategic would be looking at the situation. Next slide, please. So, for the strategic, people and situations are not fixed. Rather, they are created and negotiated through language. In difficult situations, the context and the situation are redefined to be appropriate. And as a result of that, strategics have a heightened sensitivity to language that many of us do not, and most conventionals do not. Now, if they have a heightened sensitivity to language, one of the things that we know from research is that, in fact, they're probably most sensitive to the framing concept. Now, a possible downside, however, is that they might be seen as manipulative if they don't have our best interests at heart. And so this is something important to keep in mind. Let me give you an example. When President Bill Clinton was testifying during the Monica Lewinsky deposition, he was asked a question, and he famously responded by saying, "It depends on what the meaning of the word is." And of course, perhaps only an attorney and former Rhodes Scholar could have made such a statement, for which he was widely mocked in the press at the time, and many of you may have remembered that. If we could go to the next slide, Melanie. Another example of an expressive comes from Mark Dreesen, founder of Netscape and board member of Facebook. He tells the story of a strategic who had an idea that sounded a bit preposterous. In fact, he was called to San Francisco Airport late at night in 2007 with a guy who had a thin but impressive resume who wondered if social networking might help him defeat the overwhelming odds against him. This was 2007, and the strategic was, next slide, please. The strategic was Barack Obama. Now, whatever you think of Obama, or whatever your feelings are towards him, he is widely regarded as having changed the face of modern political campaigns. Here's what Andreessen said. It was like a guy in a garage who was thinking of taking on the biggest names in the business. What he was doing shouldn't have been possible, but we see a lot of that out here, and by that he meant Silicon Valley. And then something clicks. He was clearly super smart and very entrepreneurial, a person who saw the world and the status quo as malleable. And those last few words are really key here. A person who saw the world and the status quo as malleable. That's the classic mark of a strategic, okay, the classic mark of a strategic. And so what I tell my students is that my goal is to try to get them to move from being a conventional, in most of their cases, to a strategic, but with a strong sense of ethics, with a strong sense of moral purpose. And so, next slide, please. Here we see some other examples of strategics. As I mentioned, Bill Clinton is an example of one. Certainly Martin Luther King would be an example of a strategic. The late Steve Jobs was clearly an example of a strategic. And I would also argue Sarah Palin. She, ran, of course, in the last presidential elections to vice presidential candidate. It's been really quite remarkable how she's been able to maintain her presence in a very strategic way on the national scene. For example, with a reality show, Fox News gig, Facebook, interesting vehicles that she essentially controls. So again, my goal is to move you to become more strategic, but with a strong sense of ethics and moral accountability. Next slide, please. So what might be a strategic's guide to understanding how we create reality through our communication? There would be three things that I would say here. First is that effective framing is the ability to define the situation here and now in ways that connects with others. So we can think of communication as an act of transmission as being pretty simplistic, right? And as a result of that, thinking of communication as about the creation of meaning sounds a little abstract, but when we think about framing as simply defining the situation here and now in ways that connects with others, I think we have a way at getting at this root concept in a different way. Because we can go back, for example, to Tony Hayward, the former CEO of BP Oil. He was articulate, no question about it. Attractive leader, no question about it, but he failed to connect in those moments. And as a result of that, he's no longer CEO and was banished to Russia and working on a project there. So he certainly is a guy who wanted his life back and got his life back. Secondly, through framing, we create realities to which we must then respond. Now, here it's important to keep in mind that I'm not talking about using language to, make things happen that shouldn't. For example, if you're in prison, you can't frame your way out of prison. Or if a plane crashes outside the building, you can't change the reality of the plane crashing. But where there is uncertainty, where there is ambiguity, you have an opportunity to use framing as a skill to help define the situation. And based on the ways in which people define the situation is, in fact, how they choose to act. So it's very important to keep in mind that where there's uncertainty or where there is ambiguity, there's an opportunity for framing that lies there. And oftentimes, it is the ambiguity of the situation that we're in that opens it up for interpretation and why one or more individuals may emerge into a leadership position. It's because these individuals have a sense as to what might be happening, and as a result of that, they're able to supply a measure of certainty, a measure of the reducing ambiguity for people at key moments when they want it. Can we go to the next slide, please? So a really key, then, set of skills to have would be 3. And I can't go into the kind of depth that I would like to here. Let me simply say that if you take a look at the power of framing, you're going to see much more about this, but let me try to whet your appetite, if I could, just a bit. So the first of these skills is to develop your mental models, okay? And here I would say that leaders who understand their world can explain their world. If we could go to the next slide, and what you see in front of you is Father Michael Graham, who is the president of Xavier University here in Cincinnati. Now, I don't know how many of you are Catholic out there or what you know about Catholic priests, but let me tell you that they are not known for their oratory. Yet this is a guy who routinely gets applause in the Catholic churches that he speaks in after he speaks. And that's quite remarkable. So I wanted to sort of understand this speaker a bit more because I thought this was a classic strategic. How would I begin to understand what's happening? Why was he different than others? And this really came to light a couple of years ago around Martin Luther King Day when, in fact, he was asked, along with several other city leaders, to give a quote about Martin Luther King Day and the meaning of that. And I just want to read for you, if I could, what he said, because I think you might find it interesting. He said, Dr. King is typically remembered in a kind of soft and fuzzy way that tends to blunt his message, effectively domesticating him and, for many, making his memory less troublesome and easier to bear. What Dr. King's memory reminds me constantly is that the most important issues to deal with are structural big picture issues, and that's precisely at the fault lines of race, class, and I would add gender, that America has a long way to go before it delivers on the promise of the noble words of our founding documents. Well, I was really struck by those remarks, and I was struck by the prescience of them, because in the 9 other quotes from city leaders, and this included, interestingly enough, our mayor, a city council member, 2 other local university presidents, including my own, another religious leader, a community action organizer, 2 NAACP branch presidents, and a city school superintendent, each, in fact, delivered a soft and fuzzy on Dr. King, however heartfelt and sincere. What was a white, middle-aged, male, Catholic university president from America's heartland doing by suggesting that King's message had been softened, blunted, and domesticated? Was there not a touch of irony that he, or at least surprise, that he was underscoring these structural big-picture issues at the fault lines of race, class, and gender? So I think we can begin to see here what that value added is of a strategic, because they have that capacity to take a look at a situation in a new way and offer insight that we find helpful. Next slide, please. How do we develop our mental models? That's the key question, and that's what the book explores. The real easy answer is that we develop our mental models through age and experience. The harder answer, though, actually comes from brain science, and here it's quite fascinating because what we're learning is that the brain will reorganize itself when we train in increments, training incrementally, that increases in complexity each time, and also when we have a lot of practice, what they call mass practice, or essentially immersion into the subject matter at hand. Next slide, please. And you'll see this with a type of organization called a high reliability organization. Here, examples of these would be the military, it would be the aircraft carriers, police and fire units, NASA, airlines, mining operations. And as you'll see on the right-hand side of the screen, high reliability organizations all emphasize safety and reliability. And so they're not as concerned with efficiency and bottom line issues because human health and safety is crucial. And so what they do is they train incrementally. That is, every time they have an incident, they are essentially going to school on that incident to see what have they done, what could they do differently. And they train continuously as well. So they're repeatedly surfacing their mental models when they make mistakes or even when potential mistakes can occur. And so they are preoccupied with failure. Now, this is not an example of a self-fulfilling prophecy where they're expecting failure, not at all. But they really frame success as near failure so that success doesn't breed complacency in them. So they're continuously developing their mental models. They're continuously exposing themselves to new content, new situations so that they develop them. And what so many of these individuals tell me, especially in emergency situations, is that the training, that very fresh training that they received, is what they rehearse on their way to the next emergency. And in fact, that's the kind of thing that prepares them or primes them for a more spontaneous performance. And that takes us to our next key framing skill and the next slide, Melanie, and that is technique number 2, prime for spontaneity. Now, one of the things you may have been hearing of late when we talk about brain science is that our brains are not hardwired. Our brains are muscles. In fact, use it or lose it is a phrase that we associate with our muscles. In fact, this is the phrase to also associate with our brains. And our brain is what some scientists say is very plastic. And we have to understand that plasticity, if you will. So what brain science teaches us more and more is about priming. We usually think of priming as priming a pump. Here, I always think about the apple farm I visit every fall where older children gather around an old pump where they must work the pump for several seconds before a rush of water comes spilling out. That's the basic principle. But a better example is to think about the last time you were at a restaurant and you were asked what name the restaurant was. And gosh, you can picture the restaurant, you can picture what you had, you knew who you were with, but gosh, you couldn't think of what the name of that restaurant was. Well, when do you learn that name? You know, it pops out in the shower the next day, you're driving to work, or you're doing something else and you think, oh my God, that's what it is. Well, how is it that that name just pops into our minds at some later point? Well, what you've effectively done when you were trying so hard to think of the name is primed your conscious mind, right? And you're consciously thinking through what you were trying to recall, and that essentially primes your unconscious. It leaves an unconscious imprint. Psycholinguists study what's known as tip-of-the-tongue experiences, and that's what that restaurant experience is, right? It's on the tip of your tongue. You can't quite remember it. And in fact, we're beginning to learn a lot about priming. Any of you who are reading Daniel Kahneman's recent book, Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, you'll see how much priming is a part of that book. It's really quite simple, and what we understand is that conscious recall leaves an unconscious imprint. We do it when we practice a golf swing, when we study for a test, when there's a speech rehearsal. But what brain scientists are telling us, and this is the key message here, is that we vastly underestimate the value of priming because we don't do it systematically enough. And if you begin to understand how the unconscious can be primed for all kinds of situations and experiences, you begin to understand the value of priming. And I would even say priming for remembering a certain language you want to use, language you don't want to use. A great example here comes from Marin Alsop, and if you could go to the next slide. She is the first woman to lead an American orchestra. And she tells the following, I'll say it in her words. She says, I applied to audition for Tanglewood, which is a Boston music festival, 5 times before I got an audition. One day they called me in and said, "We've decided you're going to conduct with Leonard Bernstein." I was stunned. Bernstein was more than a teacher. He coaxed the essence out of people. He talked to me about being me. There was one rather cathartic rehearsal day when he came up to me and said, "The conducting's fine, but it really isn't moving me." I was so devastated. Then he said, "Let's give the orchestra a break, and then you'll come back and do this again." He said, "Forget about conducting now. Just be yourself and be the music." And then I came back, and it was the weirdest experience. I felt like I'd had a massage. I thought I had nothing to lose. I'm just going to try it. I remember in the middle of the piece, this makes me cry, he came up to me and whispered, "That's it." It was so liberating, end quote. So at Bernstein's urging, or shall I say priming, to be herself and be the music, Alsop delivered a spontaneous performance that emerged even her, that amazed even her. Bernstein triggered a lot of implicit knowing by Alsop, of not just knowing how to deliver the music, but how she delivers the music, how she feels in her best moments of leading an orchestra. So what was so liberating, what felt like a massage, was one that could actually one could actually control a spontaneous performance with a little forethought, with a little priming. So again, I urge you to take a look at the book if you'd like to learn more about what priming can do in terms of our communication. So our third and final technique, if you'll go to the next slide, Melanie, involves using positive emotional contagion. This is a fancy sounding word that really just simply addresses the fact that our emotions are contagious, and also recognizes that our framing is not just about the language that we choose, but it's about our bodies, right, and how we move and how we position ourselves and what our faces say and how we gesture. And one of the things we are also learning from brain science is that, in fact, humans have a tendency to mimic the expressions of others and the emotions of others. And this mimicking occurs through something called mirror neurons, which are terribly important, and we're just really beginning to learn more and more about them. But what it means for framing is that we have to have what we might call high energy framing in order for others to begin to appreciate and connect with our emotions. And the best example I can give of this happens to be a guy that I worked with for several years. And he has very flat affect. If you take a look at his face, you don't really see a whole lot of expression. And I swear the whole first year I worked with him, I thought he was mad at me. And I just didn't understand that this was a guy that didn't have a lot of energy around his communication. What we're learning is that this energy is important. And we read others through these mirror neurons. We read their bodies with our bodies, and they're terribly important. So again, the book gives you more techniques and ideas for understanding this, and I would direct you to them. If we could go to the one more slide. You'll see that in the book there's a lot of opportunities for structured reflection so that you have some time to sort of dwell on some of the points that I'm making and think about it in terms of your own lives. Those of you who do training and development, there's downloadable framing tools that you can modify. There's also a glossary of terms so that if folks want to regularly consult or look at some ideas, you've got the definitions there, and also more PowerPoint slides for training. And our last slide, if we could, is back to the fish. So I would simply ask you, do you see the water, and can you help others to see the water as well? Thanks so much. I'd love to hear your questions now.
Yes, I have a question on the three different kinds of communication styles. And I believe you said that conventional leaders were mostly conventional communicators. Why is that? Do we know why that is?
Oh, yes, I think so. And that's a great question, by the way, because you know, it's fascinating to think about how we evolve as communicators. Most of us are around 5 or 6 years of age are all in the expressive category, right? And we all know kindergartners, for example, or first graders who, tell a few tales out of school, right? They don't have those kinds of filters that most of us have, or that most conventionals have. And so as we get trained, we are increasingly taught to be good communicators by following the rules, by finding what's appropriate. And so that's really essentially how that happens, is that we're in a society where there's a set of language rules and we want to be responsive to those rules. We oftentimes aren't taught about how to see situations in terms of its multiple dimensions and therefore how to go beyond that. Some folks are, but for the most part, the vast majority of us are not. And so developmentally, it's important that we take time, I think, to begin to learn how to transition to strategics. Does that help?
My question is about Hillary Clinton's statement. It appears to be expressive, and so how would you have framed it in a more diplomatic way, or how should she have framed it in a more diplomatic way? Well,
actually, there's a couple of questions that are implied by your question, and let me just talk through that a bit. It's a really good one. If you're a strategic, which is what we would expect Hillary Clinton to be as a member of the diplomatic corps, strategics have the capacity to be conventional at times, and they have the capacity to be expressive at times. Likewise, if you're a conventional, you have the capacity to be expressive at times. If you're an expressive, you're probably only an expressive. And so it's important to keep in mind that from Hillary's perspective, giving an expressive response, which is what she was doing, essentially was right at the time. And I think she was indignant, rightfully so, because her status, her rightful status as a representative of the United States was not being recognized. And so the Congo and the context of the Congo and the women's issues that were taking place during that time as well were something that she was also quite sensitive to. So I would argue that that was an appropriate response from my perspective, given the conditions. Now, she could well have, perhaps understood that or suggested to the young man who had asked the question that perhaps he, meant to ask President Obama, and he forgot that, in fact, it was Obama who was president at the time and not Bill Clinton. I mean, that might have been one way that he could have, she could have been a bit more diplomatic around that. But on the other hand, she made a very effective point in the way that she did.
Gail, I have a question. I'm just wondering if people...
If you're a strategic, so in other words, a strategic has the capacity to respond conventionally and has the capacity to be expressive. But as I said, an expressive, not so much.
Each other. What happens when people with different styles get in conflict with each other?
Yeah, that's interesting. It really does depend on how the styles match up. So that if an expressive is in conflict with an expressive, a conventional in conflict with a conventional, and a strategic with a strategic, then those individuals are most likely to only get into conflict about the issue. When their styles differ, there you're going to see individuals not only engaging in conflict over the issues, but boy, their style's going to bug the heck out of them. So, for example, an expressive is going to think that the strategic is trying to pull the rug over their eyes, right? There's going to be a manipulator. Or, alternatively, a strategic might think the expressive is rude And, you know, how can they use language in a way that is just so overly blunt? So you begin to see how individuals with those different styles will really not mesh very well if those styles differ. And there's lots more then to be in conflict about. I think we have a lot of common expressions for this. You know, one bad apple kind of thing, or when someone says, gee, your enthusiasm is contagious. I mean, so we've already known, I think, on a kind of common sense level that an individual's presence and their emotions can be uplifting to some of us. It can drag others down when they're feeling sad or depressed. And I'm just suggesting that what we're learning from brain science these days is telling us that we're not just listening to what people are saying with our ears, we're listening with our bodies. And we have these mirror neurons in which suggest that we are essentially mimicking what we are seeing, what we are experiencing in other people. And so the message to take away from this is that you've got to understand how your body is also an instrument of communication as you're engaging, as you're using framing. It's not just your words. It's not just that language that you choose. So facial expression, so body position, movement, all of these kinds of things come into play, and it's important to keep those in mind as we consider how we best communicate. I think when we talk about establishing trust in a work environment, this is something that doesn't get a lot of attention. We do focus a lot on the discrepancy between what people say and they do, and rightfully so, but there is also a lot, I think, associated with how we make people feel uncomfortable or comfortable based on how we are responding and how our bodies are positioned. And there's more about this we're beginning to learn that the research shows.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Gail. I think we all learned a lot here. I know this was a very different sort of session than we've had before. Sorry for the technical glitch there in the beginning, but I think we all learned a lot from it. And I'll be sending the slides out later. So let's just thank Gail Fairhurst for what she's brought to us. Appreciate that. And
it's been delightful.
Gail. And please join us next month. We're going to be talking about performance management and the changes in the GPRA. So have a great day. Thank you very much, everyone.